Can a president pick a vice president from the same state? The answer is sort of, but it probably isn't going to happen very often. Here's an explanation as to why. The 12th Amendment to the United States Constitution sets certain restrictions on who can be president and vice president and how they're chosen. One of the things it preserves from the original text of the Constitution is a requirement that the electors of the Electoral College have to vote for one of those two, the president or vice president, who is not from the same state with themselves. So in other words, the president can pick a vice presidential candidate who's from his own state. There's no rule against that. What he has a problem with is that the electors from his state can't cast ballots both for the president and for the vice president. The reason for this originally was we were very concerned about sectional tension. There was concerns that big states like New York or Virginia would dominate the landscape of the federal government and would oppress the other states. So they required that when you went down as an elector to pick your president and vice president, that you had to vote for at least one person who wasn't from your state. Now, the weird thing about the original system is you would actually cast two ballots, and both of them were for president. So the electors who were elected by the local people, you'd go to the local place and you'd say, I know Bob, he's my neighbor, he'll be a great elector. You send him off to vote. He would then go and he'd cast two ballots. One for George Washington, he'd say he'd be a good president, and John Adams, he'd be a good president. And the guy who got the most votes would be president. The guy who got the second most votes would be vice president. This worked for exactly 2 attempts. It worked when we had an agreement on who everybody wanted for president, which was George Washington. The moment that we had contested presidential elections, we had a problem, which was that the guy who got the most votes became president, and everybody's second pick, who was going to be diametrically opposed, would be vice president. So imagine that today we all go to the polls and, Joe Biden becomes president and Donald Trump becomes vice president. Not exactly a recipe for success. So after that happened with John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, who at the time hated each other, everyone got together and said, we need to change this. And they passed the 12th Amendment. And it changed it up. And it said electors are now going to vote very clearly for a president and a vice president. But it preserved that language that said those electors who vote on it, they have to pick at least one of those guys from a different state from themselves. So in the examples I'm seeing thrown about, if Donald Trump were to select Ron DeSantis or Marco Rubio to be the vice presidential candidate, when November happens and everyone goes out and votes, Florida's electoral votes, it's a lot of them, when those electors go to vote, they can't vote for both of those people, probably. They would have to vote for one of them. So let's say they voted for Donald Trump, but they don't vote for Marco Rubio for vice president. And as a result, if Florida's electoral votes are the difference, the vice presidential election gets thrown into the Senate. You have to have a majority of the electoral votes to be elected either president or vice president. And if there's not a majority, the House of Representatives picks the president and the Senate picks the vice president. So assuming those electors all vote for Donald Trump and don't vote for Rubio or DeSantis or whoever the Florida person was in that scenario, then the United States Senate has to come and make the decision of who becomes vice president. And we ironically could be in that same situation where perhaps they pick, say, Kamala Harris instead of the person that Donald Trump wanted, and you have a split ticket now in the White House and in the vice presidency. That's all fairly unlikely, and here's the main reason. The electors can't vote for both people if they are inhabitants of the same state, and that's the term it uses. It says they have to vote for at least one person who is not an inhabitant of the same state with themselves. Presumably, Senator Rubio or Governor DeSantis could, move out of the state. Presumably, they could find a way to become an inhabitant of another state. For this reason, it's probably not an issue for them to pick people from the same state, and I don't know that that would be an insurmountable obstacle. But there's a brief explanation, hopefully brief, explanation of why the 12th Amendment means that generally presidential candidates pick a vice president from a different state so they don't have to mess with this problem.